All right, what is up, guys? RLTKPHX podcast, Real Talk Phoenix, episode 32.
32.
Right? We've been having some really great podcasts the past couple of weeks, I feel like.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited for today's podcast. As you guys know, there's a lot of stuff going on in our world right now. A lot of different conversations about local law enforcement and about their interactions with people and all those different types of things. And so today we wanted to really hear from somebody that lives in that world and in that space, and kind of get their perspective on what that's like and how they see that working out and what's the future of all those types of things look like. Me in particular, as a young Black man, I call myself young.
Yeah,
I'm excited about it because it's not every day that you get these opportunities. Yeah. And so I wanted to introduce you to you guys, my friend Ben.
Yeah.
So Ben, what's up?
What's going on?
What's up, my man?
Chilling. Excited for the podcast.
Yes, for sure. And so Jordan was introduced in a little bit, but for those of you who are in audience and you know me, I've got a lot of friends, and so I'm going to be careful. We want to be careful if you're wondering why the screen is blacked out, just for the sake of controversy, for the sake of protecting people's careers and things that may get dusted up. We decided to keep his identity concealed so that he could be 100% transparent. We don't want you guys to think that, on our podcast that we're trying to play any funny business or anything like that, or just give you one side. As you've come to know, we're conversationalists. And in that conversation, sometimes things can get out of balance. You start talking to people who always tell you the same things and who agree with you all the time, or who kind of line up with your viewpoints. And so we thought it would be cool to have someone who was from law enforcement, but at the same time, a little background on my buddy Ben. We've been friends for a long time. He's got a rich history of just serving and loving people. He's not just a dude out here who, joined the law enforcement because he wanted to carry a gun around and control people. Like, he's a really great dude, but I don't want to get into too much of his story. I want to let him do that himself. So Ben, why don't you take it away, man? Share with our audience maybe a little bit about your story, whatever you feel like sharing, and then kind of explain to them what got you into law enforcement.
So I will start off by saying I really didn't want to get into law enforcement in the beginning. In fact, when I was a kid, I remember just hating cops. Like I'm such a hip hop dude. And so like, I grew up with that culture, right? And it's like F the police and all that kind of stuff. That was the music that I grew up on. And I didn't know anybody that was a police officer.
Oh, wow.
So that culture spoke louder to me than anything else because I didn't have a opposing viewpoint from that. So, going through in high school, I became a Christian and was actually pursuing a role in ministry. So I was actually licensed as a minister when I was 17 and went to Bible college to really kind of pursue the educational side of that. And when I was in college, I got an opportunity to go speak at a church. And I was doing a message, and it was really focused on the Good Samaritan and kind of the word picture. I'm one of those guys that learn from word pictures. And so the word picture that came from it was kind of based upon Cross Movement, which is a Christian hip hop rap group back in the day. So they had an album called Human Emergency, right? So it was kind of based upon this idea of emergency response. And it really led me to a place of thinking like, man, within the confines of that story of the Good Samaritan, like when you see a person that's laid out on the side of the road, like in the story, those are signs and signals that there's an emergency. And in the same way, a police car has those lights and sirens. Those are signs and signals that an emergency is going. But the question is, do we yield to that emergency like we're supposed to do legally? We're supposed to move to the right. Do we yield to that emergency, or do we just keep on going?
Wow.
And so at the conclusion of that message, I got approached by a guy who came up to me and was like, if you want to see a human emergency, you come ride with me.
Wow.
And I'm like, I don't really know who this dude is. Like, that was my first time to ever meet him. So that was like his first opening statement to me. He's like, man, come, I'm a police officer. Come ride with me. And I'm like, well, I'm thinking, I don't really like cops, but, maybe we'll get some free donuts.
Dang.
Like we'll just ride around and, I'll watch him write people tickets and, ruin their lives because that's what cops do. That was my mentality of it. And so I got an opportunity to go ride with them, and man, it blew my mind. We were going to so many calls of like domestic disturbances and, people using weapons to hurt one another. And I was seeing the richest house, in the city. And I saw the cheapest house in the city. And it's like, there was so much stuff in there that I'd never seen or experienced before. Mm. And I remember being in that patrol car, and God said, when I called you to ministry, when I called you to helping people, this is what I was talking about.
Wow. So it was that clear to you.
Yeah, that honestly was a difficult road to walk in that regard, because it was like, I grew up hating them, and now it's like, and now I'm supposed to be one.
No, you can be one.
Yeah. So from the law enforcement perspective, that's kind of how I started down that road. I got an opportunity to meet some additional police officers, and I rode with about 4 or 5 different police departments, just, sitting in the front seat, just talking to officers and learning about what that looked like. Mm. I put in an application at one department in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I got hired, and I've been there 15 years.
Wow. So what were some of those, like you're saying, some broad things about things that you were seeing, but does anything really kind of stick out in that time when you were exploring that really, really solidified it? Or was it just a culmination of everything, like as you went on and had conversations?
Man, there was so many things that were both good and bad that I experienced, while I was finishing my school. So that whole call into law enforcement probably happened maybe my sophomore year of college. And so basically I got 5 years of college, and I stuffed those 4 years that you're supposed to do into those 5 years, and was able to get my degree and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, all that to say, it was crazy because like with some officers that I rode with, I remember being at one department and I was in jail because let me clarify. I was not in jail in that regard. Like I was in dispatch. I was watching an officer who had arrested somebody while the officer I was riding with, was doing a report. And I was just watching the closed circuit TV, and they brought in this individual who was probably a 19, 20-year-old kid that got arrested for shoplifting. And this kid was running his mouth. Yeah. And the officer that was dealing with him basically grabbed him at the neck and lifted him off of his chair. Whoa. And basically pinned him against the wall and slapped him across the face twice. Like I watched that happen.
Wow.
And I remember thinking like, is that what cops are supposed to do? Man. Like, because that reinforces the brutality that I've seen all these years on TV, right?
Right.
So I have that extreme. And then I go to another department and ride with another guy. And we went to Chick-fil-A, because of course God has his hand on that place.
Hey, come on, bro. I felt like.
Hey, hold on. Commercial break. Popeyes is flames, bro. Popeyes chicken sandwich.
But I did feel a little twinge in myself when he mentioned Chick-fil-A. That Polynesian sauce.
Hey.
Sorry, we're way off track. So Chick-fil-A.
So we're in the drive-thru, right? And so like every Chick-fil-A is, we pull up and they see that it's a police officer and they're like, hey, thank you for your service. And there's 2 of us in the car, and they give us free food. And the officer's like, no, hold up. How much is it? And they're like, sir, our pleasure. We got you today. And he's like, no, seriously, how much is it? And they said, sir, we're not going to let you pay it. It almost became a point of dispute. So the officer's response to that was, well, how much is the meal for the people behind us? And they're like, well, it's $13.75 or whatever. So he went ahead and handed them the money. and paid for the people behind us. And before we left, he said, do not tell them I was the one that paid for it. Now, it's an interesting side note because obviously we're in a marked patrol car, but also that particular agency puts the officer's name on the side of the patrol car.
Mm.
So if he was doing it for self-glorification purposes, man, that would have been a dope opportunity for him because his name is right there and they could go, man, that great cop just paid for our meal and there's his name. Let's call in and give him a compliment and, maybe he could get that attaboy. He wasn't about that.
Man.
And those two conflicting stories are a lot of what I saw over my years of research and volunteering and trying to figure out kind of what I'm going to look like as a police officer, right?
What was it about the second story, the second guy at Chick-fil-A? What was it about that and seeing him do that really moved you?
That he didn't have to do it. I think for me, like
good
thoughts that were going through my head was like, what if the people behind us had felony warrants out for their arrest?
Wow.
And he just straight up paid for their food without knowing any information about them. And on the flip side of that, the other thought that I had was, man, maybe that's a single mom who was trying to decide, okay, do I put money in my car, in gas so I can get to work in the morning, or do I feed myself and my family right now?
Yeah.
And had to make that decision. And either way, he took care of the people regardless of who they were.
Yeah. I mean,
that really was my impact.
What really sticks out to me, bro, just listening to it is he didn't use his privilege for himself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's like, for me, that's a big deal. Because I think if I was a cop, bro, I'd
be rolling up
I'd be at Chick-fil-A every day. I wouldn't even be on duty. I'd just put my uniform on, get some Chick-fil-A.
There are those dudes. Trust me.
That's why I should not be a cop.
He's not a cop.
They order, they'll get off of work and they'll go hit the dinner spot and get a whole pizza and bring it home for the whole family kind of thing. It's not cool.
Bro, that sounds way cool to me. No, but that's awesome. I can tell, man, it's the character aspects meant a lot to you,
Yeah, and I bet that was really difficult to look at too, see those two different worlds in that space. So how in your mind did you reconcile the reality that there's great good and great bad happening in the same space at the same time?
I feel like I've been successful in that because I've seen the polar opposites on both sides and everything in between. We've seen, just the regular person who's the homeless person on the street. We hear stories about those individuals that are really millionaires. You know what I mean? And they've basically dedicated all their money to serving other people, and they've just chosen to live that lifestyle. So, their detriment is somebody else's gain. We see those news stories. We also see the flip of, people that are basically using their power for improper purposes, and they end up in prison. And so I've talked to those people on both sides. And so
wow,
I feel like I've reconciled with that idea. But what I haven't, and what I struggle with, is that my timeline is a perfect representation. My social media timeline is a perfect representation of the divide that exists now. And that's where I struggle. Because I get a lot of people that I see that, are police officers, that are my friends, that I work with. And so they have these views over here. And then I have other friends, have a completely opposing view, like what I used to have. And here I am in the middle.
Right.
And in a sense, I feel very alone there.
Man.
Because it's not like people are willing to leave, quote unquote, their side to come meet in the middle. People just want to be louder instead of being one to listen.
Man, and that's why we wanted to have this conversation, bro, because it's very similar with us. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was breaking up a little bit. Yeah.
No, it's
so yeah. And to be fair, I want to have these conversations as well. I think that there are probably a good number of officers out there that are afraid to have these conversations because they can be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But I don't
Get in
think that
trouble for it, you mean?
Say it again?
Like they'll get in trouble for having the conversation or what?
That's a part of it. If they said something that could be construed a certain way, that it may be taken out of context, and there's fear that they may be painted in a certain light, versus just people. And I don't think sometimes on the other side, sometimes people hear that stuff and they just want to go to the wrong direction with it, right? They don't want to offer grace to that person that they're seeing their words and not their character. Yeah. And so for me, I'm willing to put myself out there to say, man, like, I don't know everything. I'm here for this conversation right now because I want to learn. And I also want to tell my story because my hopes are that there's somebody out there that hears it that's like, okay, dang, there's a few good ones out there. And maybe if I can identify the fact that there's actually a lot of good ones out there, right, and you have my best interest at heart, that maybe me complying with what they're requesting me to do could save my life or somebody else's life, or makes just life easier for everybody involved.
Man, that's so good. Do you have anything?
Yeah, into the next. Yeah, man. No, it's a good point. It makes me think about my own experience, right? Like, so obviously I'm a black man. I'm 6'3". I have a beard, right? I'm, a biggish build. So I can be a person that appears intimidating based on what we find intimidating in our society, right? And so there are things that I intentionally do when engaging with a police officer for any reason, if I get pulled over or whatever else, to make sure I come off as unintimidating as possible. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I'm not trying to determine that. What I am trying to say is, like you're saying, and I think it's the end goal, right? Like, at the end of the day, more important to me than anything else is going home to my wife and kids, right?
Right.
And so I'm gonna engage in situations and circumstances that could potentially be dangerous for me or for somebody else in a way that de-escalates that thing as quickly as possible. And I think, obviously in our society, there's not always equality either which way, right? But the reality is, if we do our best to behave a particular way, hopefully there'll be a favorable outcome. And to be honest, right, we see that sometimes that isn't the case.
Yeah.
We have seen that. But yeah, I just think that's important, like what you're saying.
And I think if I can interject, man,
go ahead.
The reality is that there are so many similarities between you and I, in the sense that, like, when I hit the streets, I am mindful of how I'm dealing with the public. I try to de-escalate situations because I don't want things to go south as well.
Right.
I want to go to my family, and I've got a wife of 17 years, and basically, like, I've got two kids that are young, 8 and 10. So, like, I'm the same way, that I'm careful with what I'm doing, because I'm not out there just trying to alarm people. I'm out there trying to help the public.
Yeah, it's good, man. So good. Well, we want to get into our second question real quick. We've talked about a lot of stuff, and one of the things I wanted to ask you, just to get your perspective on, man, is like, you're listening to your story. You're seeing all of these different things, good and bad. You finally decide, this is the path that I'm going to choose. And so I guess my question would be, what is the primary role of a police officer? Like, what have you learned? What do you think? What's your opinion on the matter?
So I would say, if I could use 3 words, serve and protect, right? Like, that's kind of the motto you see on badges, patrol cars, on TV, all that kind of stuff. And obviously there's a lot of things that stem off of that idea of serving and protecting. And really, we should be serving more than we protect, in a sense, because we're not always put in those situations where we're literally, protecting people aside from, the visible deterrence type. So oftentimes it is more about, serving the community and saying, hey, you left your car door open, like go close it so your stuff don't get jacked.
Right.
And so I feel like there's a lot more of that service that's supposed to be kind of a foundation within that. But I think when you look at the realities of the job, I'm also a babysitter. I'm a teacher. I'm a pastor. I'm a lawyer. I'm basically whatever people kind of turn me into, so to speak, because people have a lot of, again, miseducation about what law enforcement actually does. I mean, I've been called to people's house because their kids are, catching an attitude with them, or they don't go to school or something, and I'm like, aren't you their parent?
Right.
You go take care of this. This is not my place. So when I show up, now their kids feel like I'm there on their parents' side and reaffirming, like their parents' authority. That's not my job. The parents are supposed to reaffirm their own authority and raise them. But we kind of get used as pawns. Oftentimes when I walk into a store, I'll see some parents or whatever with their kid, and maybe their kid is acting up a little bit, and they kind of use me. They point me out and say, like, see that officer over there? He's going to take you to jail if you do something bad. Like if you don't listen to mom and dad. And I'm like, no. Like I usually go over to the kid and high five them or whatever, and just reaffirm the good side of it. And their parents are like, dang, that kind of fell through. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I want to happen.
That's a good point, bro. I didn't even thought about that sometimes you guys are used as a negative reinforcement by the public. And then people get it in their minds that the police are only there to
punish you.
Basically punish you. They turn up if something bad's happening. They're never there if something good happens. So anytime you see a police officer, you automatically assume in your mind something bad is about to happen.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
I got a story. This is just going to make you guys laugh. So I got called to a noise disturbance once, basically a loud music call.
Yeah.
And man, I show up at the door and they're very clearly having a party. It's all adults. There's nothing illegal that I'm seeing, but obviously I got a call and I have to let them know, hey, you got to keep down the music. They thought I was a stripper.
Whoa.
So like, on one hand, I was very flattered, but on the other side, you know what I'm saying? Like the reality was that like people, have so many viewpoints of what police officers are doing. And like, some are like, when they see me, they wave with all 5 fingers and they're excited and they're back the blue and super supportive, and, all that kind of stuff. And on the flip side of it, you get a person that sees me and simply because of the uniform color that I wear, they see me as blue. And automatically it goes to fear. It goes to a desire for violence against me. It goes to, just being on level 10, even if I'm like, I remember being at a college campus and I was getting some new officers, some textbooks for the police academy. I do recruiting for my department. And I walked by this dude and he had like a Death Row Records t-shirt on. And I was like, yo, like that's so throwback from my childhood because I loved hip hop, right? So I'm like, man, I see your shirt. Like, that's dope. Where'd you get it? And he's like, man, don't worry about it. And I'm like, wait a second. Like, I'm complimenting your shirt. And he caught such an attitude with me. And I'm just talking to the dude about his shirt. But because of the uniform, it was like automatically I had a completely different response from this individual than maybe if I wasn't in uniform.
Right. Man, it's just that dehumanization that we're able to get into both ways. It's like you're able to see this person no longer as a person. They're just a cop, and vice versa. When I would imagine when you're policing people, you get used to seeing the same people or the same types of things over and over again, you just be like, oh, that's those low lives. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah, man. In that vein, I mean, we've kind of talked about what the responsibility of a police officer is, what their primary duty is, but what, and I guess this is the question maybe you can help clarify for our audience, like, what are the responsibilities the citizens have?
Man, I love this question because I think that there is a huge call to action, and we see a lot of media outlets that cover stories about law enforcement and how law enforcement did X, Y, Z, and maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, whatever.
Yeah.
What we need to be seeing is news stories about citizens stepping up to become a part of the police department. And I'm not just talking about from an employment perspective, as much as I'm talking about a lot of police departments have like a citizens police academy that you can go through. It doesn't certify you or anything like that, but it basically gives you an opportunity to learn about all the different areas and divisions of a police department. And by the end of it, you leave there with a far clearer viewpoint of what your actual local police department is doing and dealing with. When I think about how, the community can be there, I think about how, really they are available to, hold officers accountable in the sense to where if they are seeing things that, aren't right, like they have an ability and they should be calling a supervisor and filing complaints as necessary. So I think that they can do that. I think that they can encourage proper legislation. They can encourage more training and offering their tax dollars to go toward building up law enforcement and emergency services as a whole, because we don't really talk about the mental health side of law enforcement very often, or at least publicly, but we see some things, and that's tough to deal with. And those things sometimes impact our general day-to-day duties, to go from a barking dog call to the next call, we got a 2-year-old that's dead. And then to be expected to go deal with somebody's stolen iPhone that they left out on the counter, and they expect me to basically go above and beyond after I've just, witnessed a 2-year-old that's dead.
Wow.
And so I think within I think within that, the community can support law enforcement, all while doing all these other things as well. Like I said, just holding officers accountable, seeking legislative change, requiring additional training, and supporting officers all at the same time. Like, polarization is not the answer. And so meeting in the middle, I think, is how the community can help us most.
Man, I 100% agree. And I was just thinking while you're talking, I think in some ways citizens are starting to do that with, like their phones and whatnot. But what I've seen with that is it's kind of like a way to instigate the cops. You know what I mean? And so on maybe if that's an extreme side, right? Like, what do you think about that idea? I know that a lot of police departments are wearing the body cams now, but just the society we're living in now, where citizens are like turning their cameras and be like, "Yo, all right, transparency." Like, what would you speak to that?
On one hand, I love having my own body cam, right? Because that is the source of vindication and clarity that a lot of officers just haven't historically had, because the means weren't there.
Right.
But on the flip side of it, I also know that unfortunately, when certain people, and really honestly, law enforcement could do this as well, but because of the way certain laws are written, they tended to show more. But people can really take small clips and show something happening and go straight to social media and be like putting the officer on blast.
Right.
In actuality, what they didn't show was the events leading up to that and the events that happened afterward. And so it's very easy for us to allow a one-sided, projection through video to communicate something, and then people kind of create their own narrative from it. And like I said, to be on the straight and narrow, I think that police departments could do that as well. You know what I mean? Like there's that side where they have their city to protect, and so there's kind of like, hey, we need to be mindful of this, but you really shouldn't be, right? Like, but there's again a lot of nuances in there that you have to consider of not releasing too much information if it may negatively impact a criminal investigation that's active, because there's a lot that goes into these things.
Yeah, and sometimes when things get released on social media before it ever has a chance to go to a court, sometimes I think like, man, how can anyone ever get a fair trial when basically they've seen, video, and who knows what's happened to videos, you know what I mean? But like, basically we've already seen the events unfold, at least parts of them. And so the public's mind is kind of already made up. And so in some regard, I see that as a good thing, but also I see it as a possible liability for good legislation to happen, like when something happens, or say legislation for good, like when it comes to a court, for them to be able to handle the case in a fair way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And instantly what my mind goes to is the most recent situation of the Ahmaud Arbery case, and this is what leads me into the whole conversation about what you think citizens ought to be doing. It's like in the video, you see 3 non-police officers basically handling a situation, whatever you see on that. And so in that regard, it's like the cops didn't get to do their job because, you know what I mean? And so what would you say to something like that?
So, I don't feel it's appropriate. And this is not coming from a place of fear.
Right.
I'm not scared to talk about the cases, but I think in the sense of respect of or understanding that I wasn't there, I don't know all the facts because, and I think it's important for me to communicate this too. When it comes from a police officer shooting, and I realize the case that you're referring to does not specifically involve a on-duty police officer using deadly force.
Right.
But if I at work were to get involved in a shooting, basically what's going to happen is my department's going to do an investigation. The county that I'm in will do an investigation. The Texas Rangers, which is our state policing agency, will do an investigation. And if it is basically a highly publicized event like Mike Brown shooting was, then the federal agencies are going to come in and do an investigation like the FBI, things of that nature. So there may be 4 or 5 different agencies running concurrent investigations because of the one shooting. And
so that's what would make things take longer, and as far as like justice happening.
Yes.
Because I think that's how most people are, or at least some of the people I talk to, they're like, God, if this had been a white person, it would have been handled like in 2 weeks. It's taken all this time and no one's done anything. So they kind of feel like, see, they're just trying to sweep it under the rug. But what you're saying is a little different.
Yeah. And in fact, if I were to get in a shooting and say it resulted in the death of another individual, even a justified situation, they actually will take a report for homicide and list me as a suspect. So I'm listed as a suspect in a homicide for justified shooting. And basically I go through due process. Now it may not result in an arrest, but basically that information is treated the same until it goes before a grand jury and a decision's made in terms of, okay, are we going to, basically charge this person formally and have them arrested, or are we going to basically drop the charges as a justified shooting? So to answer your question, yes. I've had cases like DWIs, and I realize that DWI is far different than a murder case, but I've had even felony cases that are equal to murder here in Texas that take 2 and 3 years just to get to trial.
Wow.
So the investigative process, we don't want to take shortcuts. You know what I mean? Like there are so many people to talk to, and especially on these events where there's dozens and dozens of witnesses, to get all of their statements and to process that and to, talk to different people and get all the different medias from potential, surveillance cameras that are in the area or other witnesses. Like those things take a lot of time. And unfortunately, that kind of comes off as, when you're not kind of in that loop to know exactly what happens procedurally, that may looks like, well, what else are the cops doing? They're just dragging their feet.
Man,
that's interesting. That's a lot to take in for sure.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's kind of the double-edged sword with this whole situation, though. It's like the citizens have power to turn their phones on for accountability purposes, but they don't have the right to demand how a criminal proceeding moves forward because they're not duly elected officials. So even though something's been recorded and released on the internet, you still have a criminal proceeding to go through. So when that information gets leaked to the public, the sense that the public has is, why is this taking so long? But in the past, you didn't have video evidence out before a case happened. It was afterwards, and it makes it to the newspaper, or, like a short blurb on stuff. And then you found out information as the court begin to do their process. And I kind of feel, my wife, she's not a law enforcement agent, but she works for the Department of Child Safety. And she's in court all the time with situations with people who are guilty of real criminal conduct. And sometimes I think like, oh my gosh, like, does it take this long to put this guy behind bars? Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
Yeah, man.
And like, in your mind, and this is a bit of a random question, is there really any way that those things can be done more expediently? Like, is there a reason why it takes so long other than the investigation process? Is it that there's not enough police officers? Is it that there's not enough funding? Is it like, are there macro issues at play that make the justice system work the way that it does? Or is it just, it is what it is?
It's all of the above. I mean, there are so many things within this to go toward. And to your point, I mean, it's everything from staffing to, I think the biggest issue though is that people run it, right? Like we are people who oftentimes there's a lot of people that want to do really good things and get into this job for the right reason. But on that note, it's like there's also this element to where, when you think about all the logistical things that have to happen for the judge and, how many people are really in the system as it is, who, they've got to, make the decision. I mean, they may be very clearly guilty. I mean, like the video camera showing that they did it, but because they say, well, I want my time in court, because they're just hoping for something to happen that maybe they can get off scot-free from that charge. They go ahead and challenge it. And so now we have to spend, a week or whatever on a trial that's a very obvious outcome. And sometimes, I've seen people, that are very obviously, guilty of a certain offense, and because they've got money, they're able to work it in their favor.
Man, or some kind of technicality. I've seen that with the department all kinds of times. Like some kind of technicality they get off on, they walk, and no justice ever happens with stuff.
Yep.
Because some agent didn't give the right form when they did a removal, or because whatever different. And obviously that's in child welfare, but I could only imagine it's being a million times more difficult in law enforcement.
And there's actually a case that kind of goes through that idea. It's called the fruit of the poisonous tree. And the idea of that is that if a investigation is started and it's not really done in good faith or whatever. So an example of that would be an officer stops a car and ends up finding 3 kilos of cocaine in it. And he stopped them because, he thought that their brake light was out, and it really wasn't. And there's kind of could be a mistake of fact, but if it's kind of shown that no, he knew that it was or he ought to have known that it was functional, they may throw that entire case out, and that person walks, with no charges, and everything can be just basically dropped, even though he had, all that dope in his car and was, selling it across the community. Just because of that fact that it was an unjust stop, everything after it gets thrown out.
Man.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, which once you said, and this is something we've been pointing to quite commonly in our conversations right now, a lot of these things, everybody talks about racism, sexism, those different types of things, but those things are secondary issues. The primary issue is that people are greedy and they want power. And so you see that work itself out in the justice system. Like you said, people who have money can get off. You know what I'm saying? And so even though they may have done something wrong, they may get off on a technicality. And that's not to say that there aren't times where the justice system doesn't get those people. But what we do see as well, from my understanding, is that people that are poor and don't have the ability to get themselves a lawyer or don't have the ability to pay their bond or whatever it is to get out of jail, they can end up getting stuck in the system, right? And it's not necessarily a fault of their own. And they may or may not be guilty, but because of their socioeconomic status, they get lost in the system. And the reality is, in America, socioeconomically anyways, we see that, most poor people or poorer people socioeconomically tend to be people of color, even though the poor white is a growing population in the United States.
Very true.
For me, and I've tried to do my best, and this is what we were kind of talking about in the pre-interview. I've worked 15 years in the job, and I've seen a lot of things, and as I'm exposed to the system more, and sometimes we call it a criminal justice system, I don't always find that the system is just. And that's because, again, it's dealing with people, and everybody's got their own nuances and their own experiences that they've gone through. And so I think within that, I'm thinking that, man, I've spent these years doing the best I can and the right thing. But I think the right thing for me as I'm going forward and maybe transitioning out of law enforcement, in the next 5 years with retirement, assuming that's kind of what happens, I want to kind of revisit that mentality and really try and keep the rest of my life to where it's this idea of keeping people out of jail before it's even, getting to that point. And I think there are so many things that, we could be doing as a society to try to, really challenge these perceptions and give people a lot more opportunity to stay out of jail and have a sense of education and know what their rights are, and to be able to have the opportunity to, because that impacts not only them, but their entire family and their entire community as a whole. And so if we could figure out ways to really work together to benefit, I think that why are we not doing that now?
Man, that's so good.
And I want to clarify too, I'm not going to wait until 5 years is up to kind of put this idea into play, right? I feel like I've been doing it in a sense since day one, but also my calling is one of serving and protecting.
Right.
And what some people don't realize is that serving and protecting is putting people in jail. And it's separating the people that want to devour innocent people for their own benefit. And so I don't want to demonize this idea of putting people in jail as a bad thing, because there are people that deserve to go to jail for forever.
Right.
In my mind. But at the flip side of it, if there are people that we can help salvage through education and substance abuse prevention training, and kind of addiction and recovery specialties type thing, let's do those things. Let's put some money toward that, to where we don't have to put money toward prisons.
Man, that's so good. And that really kind of leads into the next question. You kind of hit on it, but are there things that you've seen in your time at law enforcement, the other things that you mentioned that need to change? I mean, just listening to how, we interact with one another obviously is one thing, but just maybe one or two things off the top of your head, like, man, this is something that needs to change. Maybe this is why I'm here. Are there any things like that you could share with our audience that you feel like, man, here's a few things that I'm really working on to hope to see change?
I think the number one thing for me is, and I referred to it earlier, is kind of the mental health side of things.
You mean the health of the officers?
Yes.
What needs to change with that?
So I think that the fact is that when a person gets hired, they go through at least in Texas, it's required to go in and have a psychological evaluation done by a professional.
Right.
And then if they are found to not be in good psychological health, they will not get the job. But after that, there is no requirement for any follow-up during a person's career. And so I think if you are in an area, high violence, high call type thing, and even not, I mean, it only takes one call. I remember very early in my career, I was a youth pastor for a year and a half. And I remember when I was in training, I had a juvenile who killed themselves by suicide. And I remember just taking a look at this kid who was the age of a lot of kids in my youth group, who looked like he could have been one of the kids in my youth group.
Man.
And that was really impactful to me. And I'm not saying that like it messed me up to the point to where, like I was suicidal or anything like that, as much as just this idea that it was profoundly impactful and I needed to talk to somebody about, walking through these emotions that I was feeling.
Man.
Because you guys already know, in dealing with people, when you take on their emotions and you just hold on to it, there's going to be a breaking point for you at some way. And it's going to be through sin. It's going to be through, just kind of losing it and mental breakdown if you don't have healthy ways to deal with it. So I feel like, additional compensation could go toward peer support programs within law enforcement agencies, and also on the fire and EMS side as well, because they're literally putting hands on people who are, deceased, bleeding out, trying to rescue them, and knowing that they did everything they could, but everything that they could wasn't enough.
Dang.
And so just kind of, that's the thing that in my mind, and then you got to think about the ripple effects, right? Like, how would you act towards somebody else if you just saw, an 11-year-old get raped by a family member and had to go talk to that 11-year-old? What would your response be toward, other people on the following call? And I'm not saying that it's right.
You're absolutely right.
You say it is what it is.
It's understandable in a sense how that's a struggle for people to be from this idea of like having experience just as a secondary experience, right?
Yes, very trauma.
Yeah, that's traumatic.
Yeah. I was at CS for 18 months, man, and I got traumatized enough in that 18 months to make my mind up that like, no, I can't handle this line of work. But like you're saying, I can imagine, man, and you've been in it for over a decade. I can't imagine you and some of the things other guys who have been there longer have seen. And if there's no mental health care over that, dude, I could totally see.
Yeah, I mean, that's crazy to me that there's nothing really in place. You know what I mean?
Now, I will say that some departments do have, an ability like a, EAP kind of thing, where, employee assistance program to where they can call somebody and talk to them. But let's be real, man, like cops are going to want to talk to somebody else that's in the profession, because a psychological professional, although they may be helpful, they ain't seen what we've seen.
Man, that's so good.
And so we need people that are within it or who have retired, or even pastors that are able to kind of step up. And I specifically say pastors because I think that they're working within the community and a lot of times dealing with a lot of those challenging sides of things as well.
Public servants.
Yeah. I quite commonly, honestly, in my mind, I don't see a major distinction between the pastor and the police officer, because I feel like, once again, what's the job of a pastor is to love and care for the community, to protect the community. And obviously he has different ways that he can do that. But the police officer, in my mind, is doing the same thing. They're kind of in the community, taking care of the community, caring for the people that are there, protecting them when things happen. And so I kind of see it as a shepherding role, like a police officer.
Yeah.
In that sense. So it's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah. It's like, the sword, right? Like they have the sword that is talked about in the scriptures, like they don't bear the sword in vain, but the pastor has the sword of the word, That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, man. So you ready for another question?
Let's do it.
All right. So have you seen issues of racial injustice I know there's a lot of talk about there, definitely on the internet, but from your experience, have you seen any issues like that with racial injustice in PD, either how certain individuals were treated or maybe how certain employees maybe got handled? Like what's really going on there?
So I'll say for me, my department is more of a suburban type agency.
Okay.
So just kind of putting it out in that perspective that we don't really have a lot of diversity within my department as a whole. We are more diverse now than I think we have ever been. Okay. But I think through that lens, I will say that I've never heard of an officer being, racist or mean-spirited intentionally, or really accidentally, in the sense of like outwardly toward another person or group of individuals. But I will say what I have seen is that, when you're not familiar with a person or a type of person, right? Like, we'll say a Black person may not be, around very many white people or vice versa. You kind of stick with what you know, right? And so that unfamiliarity kind of rears up its head on calls to where, some cultures may do things a certain way. And if you're not familiar with that, that may seem intimidating or suspicious, or it may seem maybe almost violent in a sense. If you're the type of person, like I use, when John and I talked the other day, I use like an Italian person, right, an example. And oftentimes you'll see Italians, use their hands when they speak, or they'll speak loudly. And some people, if they don't know that about, that particular group of individuals, that may come off as scary. Man, they were using their hands and I felt like they were coming at me, or because they got inside my bubble. You know what I'm saying? And officer safety is a huge thing for us. Yeah. And so we have to really do things to encourage people to, kind of, we're watching their hands at all times. We're bladed. We're kind of off-stepped a little bit from them, keeping our gun away. And that's kind of our approach to every person, because the reality is we don't know if that's because of their culture or because they're making a move to hurt us. And so all that to say, like, I do see that is that there is a lack of cultural understanding that exists with people as a whole. And certainly law enforcement is not a place where that's not occurring as well. Right. And so I think that it's kind of within that space that maybe some of this conflict, or really a lot of this conflict, is occurring where, people are getting upset because they feel like they're being mistreated, when in actuality, the officer just needs to remain calm during the whole thing. And really, so does the other person. And then they can really talk and communicate and figure out, okay, let's both safely get home. You know what I'm saying?
Are those conversations that are happening right now, from your understanding, like, obviously I feel like society over the past decade, especially with the advent of the camera phone and the internet, the way it is, like everyone has the internet, everyone has a phone, data.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, are you seeing that like that's because of the era that we're in, that law enforcement is having these conversations internally, like, hey guys, we need to get better? Or like, what are you seeing on that?
I'm going to speak really openly here. No, I don't see a lot of conversations specifically had from a like high level, like, chiefs meeting and saying, hey guys, we're going to have this awareness type of training, right? Because it's a very difficult thing to really carve out of what we're going to look like. But when they have legislative change that basically creates, space to try and gain additional statistics, I see a lot of that happening. And so, when we talk about racial profiling and stuff like that, the conversation tends to be more of, okay, in what ways can we figure out what this officer was doing versus in what ways can we talk about, officers being people that can really talk to a wider variety of people. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think you're making a profound point, bro. And I think it's important for people to understand. And I think it's like the nuances of the conversation. And so, like, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but here's what I'm picking up. In this kind of conversation, what can happen is you have two people who don't understand each other, right? Their cultures clash, and the way that they're talking to each other communicate different things according to how they're interpreting it. But then what we see is one person in our society has been given a certain amount of power that allows them to do things that the other person cannot, right? And then in that miscommunication, some real issues can arise, and it can end up being that this person, the police officer, uses their power because they feel unsafe, the authority they've been given to take a certain action, and it may end up with something really tragic happening. And then what happens is that gets painted as, racism, or it gets painted as an abuse of power. And I think to some degree that is true, but it's not true in the way that we think it is. Does that make sense?
It's institutionally true, but not individually.
Exactly. Yes. And so I think we miss that, like the macro culture and the melting pot that we live in, and really the inability that we have to communicate with each other as humans, right? And the misunderstandings we have about each other. And then the fact that I have something that you don't have, and I'm going to use it to keep myself safe, right? And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's true. Ends up with something happening that perhaps didn't have to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I agree that probably is what the deal is, because what the byproducts of that are that certain white officers may feel like they get painted a certain way as a racist if they get into anything that had nothing to do with the fact that they are not racist. You know what I'm saying? Like they themselves, but it gets painted that way. And I think on the flip side, you may have a young black male who gets painted as a criminal, and they start bringing up his past, which may or may not have anything to do with what's going on. But it's like everybody wants to paint.
Yeah,
you know,
great.
It's like all we want to do is paint to match the agenda that we feel is most appropriate. And while that is very much human nature, it's not always the right thing. And I think we have to be far more open-minded with the nuances that exist to say, well, that cop may not be racist. And maybe even though I do have this video of this happening, maybe I shouldn't share it. Maybe I should only share it with the police department. Or there's so many things, and everybody has to make their own decision. I mean, everybody's responsible for their own. But I think there is a sense of responsibility to the general public that you have to think about how your actions or reactions are going to impact the culture as a whole.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask. What obligation does PD have to the public? Like, what are they obligated to do?
Well, I mean, obviously, we're charged with, like I said earlier, serving.
Protect and serve, right? But what I mean by that more is like, are they obligated to treat people a certain way? Are they, like I know I've seen times before, like, are citizens obligated to show respect? Like, when it comes to obligations in terms of the interactions, if that makes any kind of sense.
I got you. Okay, so there are policies that most agencies have about really conduct related stuff. And when I say conduct, I'm talking about professionalism, the way
like a code of conduct,
that type of stuff. And it is going to cover, professionalism with how you're dealing with people. And even in Texas now, because of the what they call the Sandra Bland Act, they basically, if you're familiar with Sandra Bland,
a little bit.
Texas A&M lady who basically there was a whole ton of miscommunications in that whole thing, and it ended up with her hanging herself in the jail cell.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm familiar with that case.
So they passed a law because of it?
So I'll give you a very short overview of it, but she was basically stopped on a traffic stop. Her and the trooper that stopped her, there seemed to be a conflict, and basically that resulted in her being arrested for a misdemeanor traffic violation. She ended up, while in jail, she hung herself. And there was a lot of, things that kind of came out afterward about the investigation, that there was concerns about whether or not the officer really released all the information about what happened. And
got you.
There was a lot of that type of stuff. So all that to say that the state decided to, basically create a law where there's more statistical reporting that has to occur, in addition to the traditional racial profiling stuff that we've done historically and really my entire career, if not the majority of it. But one of those things is being able to give a card to traffic violators, if they're stopped on reasonable suspicion or probable cause, meaning it was actual probable that they broke a law of some sort. They have to basically get a card that has our department's telephone number on it, ways that they can compliment the officer or complain as well. So to your point, agencies do adopt this idea of, communication, and that's something that's
they are trying to fix problems. And I think that's right. That's the view that the citizens have, is like, you guys are just going about business as usual while people are getting gunned down out here in the streets, and y'all don't give a dang about reforming your ways, and but at the same time, I'm like, bro, these cops didn't get hired to be mentors and social workers. And that's what I meant by what obligation does PD have to the citizens? Like, do I got to be this kid's social worker? Do I got to, I'm not their parent. That's kind of what you were hitting on earlier. And to me, sometimes I feel like, man, we sure are putting a lot of burden on cops to be all these things and not just a cop.
That's a tough reality of it. Because you're right. I mean, it's everything from people expecting us to, like, I always laugh. There are people that are like, well, this robbery suspect that, held a gun and shot two people, why couldn't you have just shot the gun out of his hand? You know what I'm saying? And it's like, it doesn't work that way.
Come on, Hawkeye.
You know what I'm saying? Like, as much as we're trained.
Aren't you guys like basically part of the Avengers?
Yeah, like as superhero-ish as I am, you know what I'm saying? That stuff is not the reality.
Yeah.
And so I think, there's a lot of focus from the community to, you have all these different opinions about what we should be doing and all that kind of stuff. And all we're going to do is the best that we can with the information that we have and it's known at the time.
Man, that's so good. So a couple more questions, man. And I know you hit on this a little bit earlier concerning where your police department is located. And just wanted to kind of get your opinion on this. Do you feel like there are efforts being made to diversify the police force? Like, I know you said that you kind of have some recruitment duties. Like, what are some of the things that are coming down either through policy or just things that you're hearing like, hey, let's work on diversity? Is a lot of stuff like that conversations happening or what's going on there?
It is, but again, it's a interesting conversation to have, right? Because the idea is not like, hey, go hire a bunch of black guys to go be cops, or go, hire a bunch of Asian males. Like that's not the conversation. That should never be the conversation. The conversation should always be, let's hire the most qualified person for the job. But I think within that, where you're going to recruit is an important element within that. And I think about how, what recruiting should look like. And when I say that, I'm thinking about, it's like when you go to a barber shop, right? Like I'm talking about like not just a haircut place where it's very surface conversation, but I'm talking about the barber shop where you go in and you spend time within, a community of people, and they're all razzing each other, and everybody knows each other, and it's like it's real talk. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's how recruiting needs to be. Is that when I go to these events and all that kind of stuff, like I'm Ben, I'm not officer so and so. I'm just myself, and I have interest, and I'm a person outside of the uniform. And I think about how people can use their talents and their gifts to bring that into the law enforcement realm versus us trying to just duplicate a bunch of cops. Like, I don't think today's generation is interested in just becoming a robot. I'm not interested in hiring robots either. So I think within that, like I would love to diversify my department more to really look like how the United States looks. You know what I'm saying? With different religions and different races and ethnicities and things of that nature that make us more approachable, because there are certain cultures that don't want to talk to a certain officer.
Right.
There are cultures that don't want to talk to a female officer. They want to talk to a male, or they don't want to talk to a white officer. They want to talk to a Hispanic one that speaks their language, understands their cultures. And so why are we not trying to recruit more in different circles? And so, there's definitely drives to do that, but I want to do it in the right way. Like, I don't want to just do it because I felt like, oh, this policy is written and it says I must diversify. Like, it's not
right.
Yeah, not doing it to be political, but doing it because it's the right thing.
Yeah,
that's good. That's really good.
That's my heart with it. And if I could talk too, man, it's important for me to really go into the challenge of becoming a police officer, because I think a lot of people don't understand the work that goes into it, and that, depending on where you're at, it's anywhere from a 4-month process. I'm just talking about the hiring process. I'm not talking training. It's 4 months.
Is that the stuff you mean by, like, what are the things that are challenging for police officers?
Yeah. And this is the challenge that we have in hiring people. Is that when you lose your job, you're looking for a job like yesterday, right?
Right.
You have a family to take care of. You can't wait 6 months to get a job, or a year in some places, especially in the Northeast.
Right.
So with us, there's a basic application that you do. And if you meet the minimum requirements basically of each step, you pass and you move on to the next. If for some reason you don't, you're done with the process and you have to reapply at a later date.
Right.
So the steps are, like, our application is very basic, but we have a personal history statement that's 39 pages long.
Wow.
And it's asking lifetime questions, about criminal activity, drug use. So if you smoke weed in middle school, you're going to have to talk about it to us. Job history for 10 years, every address you've lived at for 10 years, we're checking records to make sure that you didn't get in trouble with any of those things. I mean, it's very, very involved. And we're talking to probably on average 10 to 15 references about each person that we bring on. But even after that initial application, there's a written test, a physical agility portion. There's a preliminary face-to-face interview. There's a oral review board where you're sitting down with members of our department. They're asking you questions about, how would you act in this situation? Then there's a background investigation, a polygraph, a psychological evaluation, a medical, and a drug screen. And so this process, again, depending on where you're at, like, man, it's work.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people don't want to do all that. And so when you have a demonization of law enforcement through culture or, whatever, happened to where you see police as like the enemy, Like you're not interested. And even if you were starting to get interested, that process is very challenging.
Yeah, that's going to weed a lot of people out.
Yep. And it does. And so
True.
I mean, it is, right. But at the same point, man, we have a lot of openings. And that becomes a systemic thing as well when you look at agencies that are having, they're down a third of their entire department. So what do you think is going to happen? They're basically going to take officers out of the areas where there's less crime and put them where there's more crime. And you think about areas that have more crime, that means that there's more officers there to deal with it, which means more arrests, whereas other areas that are quote unquote safer have less policing.
But even if there is stuff going on over there, you're going to see less of it because you're not there.
Yep.
It's a good point.
Like I said, there's a lot of nuances that goes in with this, and we need police officers. Like we need people to have hearts for their community that are able to know the difference between right and wrong and good and bad and everywhere in between, because really that's what we're dealing with is the in between. 90% of the time. It's not always that very cut and easy. Oh, you killed this person? Okay, you go to jail. It's situations like you get a kid that, had a single marijuana joint on him and he's never been in trouble in his life and he's got plans to go into the military in 2 weeks. But if you write him a ticket or take him to jail, that ruins his opportunity to go into the military. So what do? Do you take action against him because it's like a first time or military type system, or, do you not? Like, what does that look like? And so we need people that are going to be able to evaluate these types of situations and put in an application. If you're saying that there's so many issues out there and there's so many problems with police, come be a part of the solution.
Man,
that's good, bro.
And
what are you going to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, stop complaining about everything and step up, right? I mean, that's basically what you're saying. And, when I think about 17-year-old Ben, or however old you were when you went on that. Were you 17 when you went on that car ride?
No, I was in college, so I was like 19.
Right. 19. So I'm thinking 19-year-old Ben, you get bit by the bug, so to speak. You figure all that out. What would you say to young people today? Obviously our podcast, we're for influencers of Gen Z, for teenagers today. But what would you say to either the influencers or to the teenagers, the Gen Zers themselves who are considering a career in law enforcement? Like, what are the things that you would say to them?
The first bit of advice I would have is go. Do it. Like if you're the type of person who's spent a lot of time thinking about it, go do the research. Figure out what it looks like. Go talk to officers, go do that ride along that I refer to. Figure out what that would.
How hard is it to get a ride along? You could just.
It will depend on the agency's rules. There are some departments that'll say, hey, we're only going to allow, people that live in our community to do a ride along. Some will say we'll allow whoever to do it. Some it's if you're a friend of an officer, you can do it. So there are typically ways to do it. You just have to call around and ask those questions.
Got you.
And you also have to have a clean background to be able to do it. You know what I'm saying? Because you're going to sit in a front seat of a police car with access to rifle, a shotgun, police radio, police computer that has criminal history information, that type of stuff. So, if you've been convicted 7.5 times for felony, offenses, they're going to say no to you. So be an influencer in another way. You know what I'm saying? But I think at the same point, like if you really legitimately have an interest in getting into this job, go figure out what it looks like and be honest with yourself and those, that are around you when you're going through it as well. Because the number one reason people don't get jobs is because of the omission of information and deception. So it's just like in the regular world, man, like people want jobs and they're willing to say whatever instead of just coming out there and being like, yeah, I smoke weed 20 times type thing when I was growing up, and I've learned from it and I'm a better person. Like, I would rather hire a person that's done weed 20 times than a person that is gonna lie about things.
Right.
Even if they've done it like once or whatever. Like, I've even had one person that told me they did smoke weed and then later found out that they didn't.
Oh wow.
Because they felt like it would give them a heads up, so to speak, because they felt like that would make them more like the rest of the applicants.
Mm-hmm.
So just be honest about who you are and bring what you have to the table, because no matter what your thing is, like my thing is hip hop, like I said earlier, and I've worked for a record label. I've done a lot of promotions. I've been a booking manager for an artist before. So like, I'm well acquainted with that community, and I love sharing that with people, because that's one of those things where you're like, wait, you're white and you're a cop and you're this, and they start kind of putting you in a box, right? And then they find out, it's like, wait a second, like you actually know stuff, like people kind of thing. And it's like people get tripped out by that. Well, come do that same thing with whatever your thing is and use that for good within your community.
Man, that's
good, bro. It's really good. Hey, quick question for you. Something it's on my mind a little bit. It's more of a macro question, but I just want to get your opinion on it. So obviously there is a barrier of mistrust, particularly between the Black community and police, right? And obviously that goes back to all different types of things throughout the history of the United States. And so you as a police officer, seeing everything you've seen, what would you have to say about that mistrust? And what are some ways perhaps that we can begin to build that bridge again between police officers and people of color?
Or for the first time, maybe.
Yeah, or for the first time. Like, what needs to happen in your mind? Like, what are some things that need to happen in communities?
I think that humility is the foundation of all this. Understanding that there's a lot of hurt that exists within communities. And I think that the only way we're going to understand, like when I say we, I'm talking as police officers, I think we generally understand that there's hurt out there. But when we're actually allowed in to circles is when things start changing. So what that may
what do you
look
mean
like,
by that?
Yeah, so what that may look like is if there's like an event going on within, I mean, let's just call it how it is, right? Like typically the division that you're referring to is the Black community and white police officers, right? So maybe what that would look like is if the Black community may allow officers to come in and, have discussions over a meal. And I'm not talking about a televised event where it's like, hey, everybody, we've got the white cops coming over and we've got the Black people showing up and we're going to talk about these issues. Like, it's not about that as much as it's about this idea of let's drop some of this who's going to talk loudest and who's the more right, and just listen. And I think that is the foundational thing that comes through humility, is just being able to go, man, like, tell me some of your experiences. And as you hear those experiences, you learn more about a person and you understand why there's mistrust. And then you hear from the other person and you may find yourself actually trusting somebody and going, man, at first I didn't like this dude. I mean, it's just like everybody else, right? Like, there are people that you've met for the first time and you're like, man, nah, skip this dude. He's a punk or whatever. And then you actually get to learn about them and you're like, oh, I get it. The reason that they're like this is because this happened to them, or this was their, perspective, and things change. So I feel like maybe that's the approach, is not on a wide level, let's try and do this big event, but rather just on I'm just going to go into the community and meet with people, and I need to be accepted. I need to be heard from as much as I want to hear from them. So I think that that's kind of where things need to start, is just on a one-on-one basis, and really being open to change.
Man, that's so
That's
good.
dope.
And that really kind of leads us into our last question to wrap it up. I know that we've kind of talked about your faith basically from the very beginning of the podcast, and there's been times, and not everyone in our audience are believers, but we do share some things in common, and that's that we care about the next generation. And just was curious, about you, like, what are some of the things concerning your faith? How does it guide you in your role as a law enforcement officer? Like, what's been the story on that for you, man?
It's been such an amazing journey of both good and bad, throughout my career when it comes to faith. When I went to a Christian college and I saw I expected to see a lot of, good people doing good things, I ended up seeing a lot of racism.
Wow.
In fact, John, I may have never told you this story, but in the city I went to college, after my wife and I got married, so this was 2003, we walked into a furniture place and, didn't really like anything specifically there. So we're leaving out. This lady stopped us. I believe the lady happened to be Hispanic, but she says, so you didn't like anything? No, ma'am, thanks for the time. She goes, well, this is the black store. We got a white store on so-and-so street.
Whoa.
And for me, coming from a city that's very large and diverse, and like, I'd never experienced racism before. And so moving into, how that impacted my college experience and seeing a lot of Christians that were saying to do one thing one way and doing another thing, and then moving into law enforcement where I saw even more and worse things, man, I found myself being isolated, and I found myself being really lonely and looking for more things to life, even though I'm a believer and, have worked as a youth pastor and all these types of things. And it was a really dark period of my life. And when I say dark, I'm not talking about like I was going and doing, shady stuff, as much as this just idea of my identity. Like, who am I? What am I supposed to be doing? Who are other people? Can I trust people? And so there was a lot of that going on. And so I think as I got to a point to where I changed roles from working in the patrol division to working in recruiting type stuff, and my perspective started to change a lot more because I was dealing with a different type of people, you know what I mean? And I was able to get back into church where historically I hadn't been to church in years. At least consistently. And a big part of that was for no other reason but schedule, because churches are very traditionally on Sunday morning, right? And
right.
What if you worked on Sunday morning? Then what? What options do you have? And so for me, like I've seen some amazing things, man. From citizens have done amazing things toward other people, toward officers. I've had the opportunity to do amazing things for people, just kind of under the radar without anybody knowing. And like, I love that I get the opportunity. Like I talked about that officer at Chick-fil-A type thing. Like, I want to be that Chick-fil-A cop.
Right.
But I want to be that guy that's out there.
Different reasons though.
Yeah. But I want to be that guy that's out there kind of doing, buying the food for either the criminal or the single mom behind me.
Yeah.
And the only way I'm going to be able to do that is if I'm in a good, healthy place myself. And so I think my faith has navigated a lot of that, both with, I've had seasons of having a lot of questions, and that's okay. And I think I've had seasons of a lot of growth, and I've had seasons where, I just felt so broken, and I had people come alongside of me during those broken seasons where it's like, I learned that not all people are bad. And I needed that in my life. Like, I needed somebody that I could be very transparent and real with to say, man, I'm struggling with this, or whatever, and they just show love and respect. And it's like, man, that is the most powerful thing, is love. And when that actually, hit my heart and I started getting involved in church again, that started me serving again in church and working with the youth and all that kind of stuff. So I think all that to say, like, my faith has absolutely navigated me through both good and bad seasons of my life. And, as a Christ follower, I pray that my call right now as a police officer will be able to positively impact people that I deal with, whether it's them in an emergency situation where they may lose their life or they've lost somebody. On the flip side of that, to the person that I arrest, because I've been, and I will say this as a bragging point, but just a reality of police officers in general, that I've gotten many thanks for arresting people. And so that's one of the dopest things to hear from people is, like, after the fact, they come back and, hey, officer, remember me? I'm so-and-so. You arrested me. And because you treated me in this way and you showed love, man, I redirected my life and I'm now doing these things.
Man.
No better compliment than that.
That's dope, bro. That's crazy. That's cool.
That is cool.
Man, Ben, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much for coming on and spending time with us and giving us an eye into things that a lot of us don't have eyes into. And so my hope is this will be helpful for everybody who listens to it, and it'll help us learn and grow. Like we always say, this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. And so, yeah, this is the RLTK PHX podcast, the Real Talk Phoenix, episode 32.
32.
In the books. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, RLTK PHX.
YouTube.
Did I say YouTube? I think I said
think
YouTube.
You said YouTube.
Well, we love you guys, and we're grateful. Hopefully this was helpful, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace out.